Hello, everybody. Very nice to see you all today and talk with you about our work, our institutions in the UAE, art and culture today and in the future, even though we can't, see it so well these days. I just want to quickly introduce our panelists. Here we have Antonia Carver, who's the Director of Art Jameel in Dubai, an institution that supports artists and creative communities. Antonia oversees Art Jameel's work across heritage, education, and the arts, where she and her team initiate exhibitions, educational and community projects. Prior to Jameel, Antonia was the Director of Art Dubai, but we might have all first met Antonia in the early 2000s when she joined Bidoon magazine as an editor and then director of Bidoon's projects division. Nawar al-Qassimi is vice president of Sharjah Art Foundation. She joined the organization in 2010 and has worked in audience engagement and development. In her current capacity, she works alongside Sharjah Art Foundation president and director Qassimi to oversee the foundation's strategic planning locally, regionally, and internationally. Laila Binbrek is director of the National Pavilion, UAE. She oversees the operations of the National Pavilion and its participation in the Venice Biennale, as well as facilitating and maintaining relationships with the Commissioner Salama bint Hamdan Al Nahyan Foundation, the UAE Ministry of Culture and Knowledge Development, among others. Previously, Laila was director of the Third Line Gallery in Dubai. And last but not least, Reem Fadda. She's a curator and art historian and director of my favorite space in Abu Dhabi, the Cultural Foundation. Prior to this, Reem worked at the Guggenheim Museum, where we were also colleagues. She was the associate curator of the Middle Eastern Art Abu Dhabi project, where she built the museum's modern and contemporary art collection. From 2005 to 2007, she was director of the Palestinian Association for Contemporary Art in Ramallah and served as academic director for the International Academy of Art Palestine, which she helped found in 2006. So thank you very much, Abu Dhabi Art, for inviting me. Thank you, Michelle, for helping us get onto Zoom today and getting us organized. I was born in Abu Dhabi and grew up in the UAE, where I began my career. And it was in my primary roles, first at the Emirates Foundation, Arts and Culture Program, and then public programs at the Cultural Department in Abu Dhabi, where I met most of you. I haven't been living in Abu Dhabi since 2011. So much has changed since in this past almost decade, where we now find ourselves Zooming all the time because we're all kind of trying to survive this global pandemic that's affected all of us. Many of the initiatives that are important to your institutions, they include the preservation of heritage and restoration, but you also work within contemporary arts and educational programs that connect communities. There are many socio-political shifts that all of us are experiencing, and this does affect the way we work. And in fact, it might even force us to rethink work in art, the role of your institutions today, and how they may empower the communities, affected. I think what might be urgent to first address is how the current global pandemic has changed the way we work. I would like to discuss how you have had to rethink your initiatives and programming, most of which you and your teams had already dedicated a massive effort to pre-COVID. And in your view, and since this going back to work, how do you show art and engage your communities post-pandemic? What has become important to address in art, and how have you supported artists and art workers in this time? Do I have a volunteer, or shall I pick someone to start with? Nawar, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you, Fawz. Thanks, Abu Dhabi Art, for organizing this. okay, the global pandemic, I mean, I think it's something that we're all talking about a lot, and we've been having a lot of conversations about. It's obviously, for a lot of people, put a lot of our projects on hold. Specifically in Sharjah Art Foundation, we had just opened, or we're just about to open, an exhibition when we went into lockdown. And there were obviously, you know, positives and negatives to the whole thing. I mean, obviously it was a difficult time for a lot of people, but during the pandemic, we focused a lot of our time in terms of an organization and kind of a team and staff on research, on working on the things that we had always kind of set to the side and said we'll do when we have more time. And of course, ended up working, you know, odd hours and Zooming at all sorts of hours in the day. We had a conversation, and we really didn't want to go fully online. We didn't see the impact or the necessity in doing online exhibitions at a time where people were really kind of, you know, losing jobs, losing family, things were at risk. So we spent the time really planning for programs that would happen once we come out of lockdown, whenever it was. We really had no idea at the time, and focused a lot of efforts in supporting or promoting things that we were already doing. So we worked with a lot of partner organizations to gather resources of opportunities for artists, writers, researchers, open calls, and all of that kind of thing, and put it online. We really spent the time sharing a lot of information with our network and talking to one another and providing opportunities at a time when a lot of opportunities were not there. And we also focused on kind of what we were going to do next. And we had wanted to open an exhibition, Art in the Age of Anxiety, which specifically spoke about a lot of the issues or things that we saw during COVID, which was kind of the effect of, you know, post-internet and the effect of the internet and messages on people. But really during lockdown, it put everything to a halt, but we continued to work and dedicated that time to promote opportunities for artists. We still had our open call grants. We had grants for the production program, which we announced. And when we emerged out of lockdown, which was really interesting, was that we saw visitor numbers that we hadn't seen in a while. People were really eager to see art. People wanted to come to a safe space and experience art and exhibitions. And that was really, really interesting for me. I think it taught us a lot. It opened our eyes to a lot of things. I think a lot of us had a lot of, you know, there was Zoom fatigue and there was all of that sort of stuff going on. Everybody was online all the time. But it really reminded us that art is something that you have to see and you have to touch and you have to experience, and that you can't really take that physical experience away. And it's always going to be important to people. Although the online kind of aspect opened a wide reach. It connected us to one another. We had a lot of conversations and initiatives that came about, but I think it's important to remember that, you know, there are still audiences on the ground that need to see things, that need to experience things. And we were lucky enough to be able to do a bit of both, really.
Mm-hmm. And how did this work, just for the other panelists to get a chance to also answer this? Perhaps we can ask, you know, maybe Antonia, how this related to you with the Jameel Arts Center, you know, being the kind of institution it is, and also functioning on a, you know, different level. How did you, you know, deal with this kind of impact of, you know, the pandemic on the communities and on your work, and also programming with your team?
No, well, thank you. And yeah, similar to Sharjah Art Foundation, what Nawar was saying, we kind of also made that decision that we didn't want to kind of do virtual tours or put exhibitions online, but instead try to sort of use the digital as a space to reach out to people and to engage through kind of learning programs, and to sort of add to the kind of depth of research that we were able to give the public on our different exhibitions. I think we were just due to open a week before your major exhibitions, Nawar, so we were very lucky to have a week of Michael Rakowitz being open before we had to close the show. And then of course we reopened in June, and that exhibition just closed yesterday. So we've kind of feel a little bit like it's been our guiding force all the way through the pandemic, and to be able to work with a artist like Michael Rakowitz has been really, given, I think, the team a lot of solace at this time. I've never seen everybody quite so emotional to say goodbye to an exhibition as this one, because kind of all those characters and the kind of ghosts that he recreates in his work kind of lived through this time with us, and also kind of reminded us of the great sweep of history and other, even more tumultuous kind of events that have impacted on communities around the world, be it Turkey or Afghanistan, and obviously Iraq as well. So yeah, I mean, similar also to everybody else here, I think our exhibitions now last a lot longer, and that will happen in 21 and 22 as well. Partly funding realities, but also just we've learned through this time that it is possible to think slower and to really encourage your public to do that too, and to revisit multiple times, to really think deep about different exhibitions and begin to kind of see a relationship with an exhibition less as a kind of one-off visit and more as a kind of journey that you can embark on as a member of a kind of community. We also, I guess, what else did we learn? I guess sometimes to trust your gut instinct. So very quickly in March, we put together a program called the Research and Practice Platform, which we'd never done grant making before, but a lot of artists reached out and said, look, even $1,000, a micro grant is going to make a massive difference to me at this time. We ended up doing 97 different grants for artists all over the Arab world. And it was an incredible journey to go on with that too, and just realizing the number of artists that are out there working in places that we actually don't engage with nearly enough, thinking of artists in Yemen or Algeria or Libya, and being able to reach out to artists there and hear from them also about what they were doing. It almost kind of created a little bit of an online kind of community in which we were able to talk to people in different places and encourage them, as well as be able to send these little tiny bits of money that did seem to really kind of help. And then we also pivoted some other programs. So our commissions this year was supposed to be in drawing and painting, and we shifted that to a digital commission, which was won by Nadim Shoufi, who, at this moment is working on his incredible film, but, from Beirut, where his internet cuts in and out. And, he's obviously been through that summer in Beirut as well. So I think, I guess we remind ourselves pretty often in the UAE how kind of lucky we are to be somewhere that is relatively stable. We've been able to open our institutions and keep them open, and the public, similar to what Nawar is saying, the public have come back. We obviously don't have tourists, and school kids are only doing online programs, not come physically to the centre, but the number of local visitors has actually gone up, which is an incredible show of force and actually what the public are kind of looking for at this time. Sorry, a bit long.
No, that's great. That's amazing. I wanted to quickly ask you, in those conversations that you had with various artists and so on, was there anything that was recurring, that came up, that you felt that was a different kind of urgency that is emerging?
Yeah, well, I think, a lot of the applications were for people wanting to do research and to tell those kind of histories of where they're from. And they felt like in this moment, there's almost kind of more of a need for that than not, which is maybe kind of counterintuitive. Obviously a lot of people are also saying, I need to put food on the table for myself and my family to be able to sort of keep going. But I think it's something that maybe in the UAE and in the Gulf, we kind of think of being a particular problem for us, that we're in this kind of on speed history making through the present, but actually it's obviously a regional as well as a global kind of phenomenon. People really needing to tell those histories, recover those kind of stories, and be able to do deeper research and then make that available to a public.
Amazing. How has it been for you, Reem, with the Cultural Art Foundation? You had, if I understand correctly, you were just basically beginning the foundation's program after it had been closed for years and years and years, and renovations and so on. So it had reopened, and now, how has this impacted you with these questions?
Yeah. First, thank you for this invitation, Abu Dhabi Art, and it's great to be with my colleagues who I have high esteem for. and to have this conversation. It's great to listen to all of you. Fawz, it's great to see your face as well. It feels like we're in the same room while we're not.
Yeah.
And thank you for this pointed question at the very beginning of this conversation. I'll take it from not just the Culture Foundation, because I'm also involved in the Department of Culture and Tourism across a lot of our, let's say, centralized programs that impact multiple other institutions, from Culture Foundation, Berkeley, Abu Dhabi, Manarat al-Saadiyat, and many, many others, a plethora of institutions. And we really took the opportunity of COVID to think in an urgency matter. It was, because we're looking at it from a larger sector relating to a city, not just as individual institutions, we thought this is the time to think, how do we collectively, in this multitude of institutions, come together to address a real need for our societies? So that was the primary question we asked ourselves. We started to activate our sites immediately and transform them on a digital platform and online. And we created a campaign called Culture All, الثقافي للجميع, that tried to bring together this multitude of action and activity in whatever means possible from these various sites that address, again, a variety of audiences that include, of course, families and children and people that we did not want to forget. And at the same time, we were responding in terms of an urgency towards our artists. We did not want to, forsake the level of work and commitment to give back to that community that needs us in this time of, let's say, status. So this was something that was really important for us here in Abu Dhabi. The valuable thing about this is we got time, right? That was something, it's something that I really cherish. It gave us the time. Yes, it feels very condensed, and Zoom meetings seem that they're never ending, like Nawar was saying, and it's true. But at the same time, it did give us this kind of moment of introspection and time to reflect and see, how do we recalibrate? What are what are our priorities? How do we want to kind of come together? How do we build up these kind of collective gestures? And at the same time, we were thinking of extending towards regional support. This is not, regional and international. So we didn't want to insulate ourselves, given the fact that we were, again, becoming ever more isolated in our own borders. So these were some of the thoughts that collectively, with all of our colleagues, we were working together on this. And in terms of Culture Foundation and some other institutions, I'll briefly kind of talk. We really kind of transformed ourselves. Our exhibitions became, we had an exhibition that was open. We had to close down our sites. We immediately created these kind of virtual tours to be available for our public, for our school visits that were still, to be able to launch it at any kind of point in time. We also didn't stop commissioning artists. We've commissioned nearly 100 artists across Abu Dhabi, and with substantial grants, the minimum being $10,000. So we did not stop in terms of the support that we lent to the community of artists. And in terms of, as the rest of my team, the rest of my colleagues here, we continued to plan for the future for our exhibition. We took that time to do the studied kind of exhibitions, to think curatorially. Our art residencies transformed online. Our movie programs became online. We have a beautiful children's library at the Culture Foundation. Such a fantastic space that is very dynamic, especially with the children running around everywhere. And this had to close down, but we thought, we have followers. We need to transform ourselves. We created an online library, beautiful online workshops and tutorials on a daily basis. We now reach schools, again, online. We do virtual tours for them. So we try to immediately kind of substitute. And the last thing I want to mention is that across also Abu Dhabi and the various museums, we have not stopped our collection building. And that's something that, you know, we avidly thought of as an important kind of gesture, not just to build our, you know, museums, but, you know, this is also a time of need for the entire communities, especially as well in the region. And we paid special attention to that front.
That's quite amazing. I mean, also just listening to you speak about what's being done in terms of children's programming. I mean, growing up in the UAE, I went to the Cultural Foundation a lot as a child, to the theater, to the library, to just even that outdoor space running around there. And that's like one of the first things I think about actually consistently, is just how our, you know, children are somehow kind of pushed aside and forgotten in this situation, and they are the future of, you know, of our world. And yes, how can to continue making this an inclusive experience, and not to forget them, and it's great to hear that, you know, the institution thought of itself as also like a substitution, as a way to kind of reach out to the children and their families who are really struggling. I mean, just in New York City here, they shut down the schools last Thursday, but yet everything else remains still open. So it's...
Yeah, and just one thing to add, actually, Fawz, just for you to know, our resource is available for anyone online, right? So you don't even have to register or be in Abu Dhabi to access the hundreds of thousands of ebooks that we have, or tutorials or videos. So it's free access. Tell your friends in New York, anyone can access it. We've partnered with a lot of publishing houses in order to do that and make that resource available. And it's also in English and Arabic. So it's also very valuable for a lot of our, you know, our audiences, the Arabic speaking audiences as well.
That's really great. Thank you, Reem. Laila, how about you and the work with the National Pavilion, and, you know, your work, you know, you're working every day, but then you're also working towards like every 2 years. So the programming kind of is like, maybe the work is slower in a way to kind of get to your, you know, biannual programming.
Actually, it's not slower, because we participate in art and architecture. So essentially, we are working on an exhibition every year. 2020 would have been our 10th participation in Venice through the Architecture Biennale, and we would be presenting Nawar and Kenichi Terremoto, who are exploring an alternative eco-inspired form of cement. I can't really say much more, but so, you know, it would have been our 10th participation. We were, when the pandemic hit, we were almost ready to start going into production and deploy to Venice, so to speak. And we had to suddenly start thinking of alternatives of what, how would we do this? So unlike my colleagues, we don't actually have a physical space within the UAE. Our mandate and everything we do happens on a more remote but very international platform, but very connected to what's happening here locally. Eventually, and we also don't set the timing. The Biennale, the Venice Biennale itself sets the timing for whenever the exhibition's open. So there are certain things that are out of our control, and then there were certain things that were. Lucky for us, in a way, well, or not lucky, depending on if you see cups half full or half empty, it was postponed. And so we actually took that time to do a lot of self-reflective, you know, in terms of, again, similar to what Nawar mentioned and Antonia and Reem, and kind of just taking that moment of slowing down, because literally our schedules are intense, really, really intense. From the moment we start, you know, we're always already thinking of the next exhibition, the selection process, appointment of the curators, getting them to then start working. There's a huge journey that happens where, you know, the exhibition in Venice is just, that opening is a small part of a much larger journey that happens around every exhibition. So we had an opportunity, one, to kind of stop internally as a team and kind of reflect and do a lot of things that we were not able to have the time previously to do, like clean up our database, for example, really important thing to do. And we maybe look into restarting initiatives that allow us to be more connected with our supporters and followers. So restarting a newsletter, a quarterly newsletter, to let people know what we're doing in terms of the research, publications, the internship program that we run. We also were able to, for Wa'al and Terremoto, we were able to funnel some of the funds. We also work in a very tight budget. So funds that we normally would have spent for our opening activities in Venice this year, which, like renting apartments, all those logistics, we were able to funnel them in towards Wa'al and Terremoto, reopening their lab space in El Cercal and continuing their research. So thereby, that journey of exploration, that journey of questioning, the collaborations that they've built with other universities in the UAE and in Japan can continue, so that they're able to then be more articulate when they are in Venice next May, inshallah. Hopefully it will happen. And at the same time, we also announced our artist and curator for 2022. So we now are in effect going to be working on 2 exhibitions at the same time with the same budget. So we're going to, juggle that somehow. But one of the things that we, learned is, again, to take the time to maybe spend time together as a team, because sometimes we're just running all the time, and you forget to just check in with your team, check in with each other to make sure that we're still sane. And also to just kind of reevaluate, what is our purpose? Like, why are we still doing this? How can we continue for the future, ongoing forward, to continue to keep our stories, our untold stories, more nuanced, to continue to build on that story that we're presenting outside, but also take the time to reconnect with our community partners locally and just know what they're doing. There were so many artist talks and studio visits via Zoom, which was really great, because a lot of the time you don't have the time to go to all the different areas around the UAE to do studio visits, but being able to visit an artist studio through Zoom is a great way to be connected for future programming or future pavilions, and who knows, and just to know what people are doing. So the silver lining of the pandemic, I think, is that Zoom was activated and we can be a lot more connected much easier, because one of our challenges previously was that we work with international curators sometimes and exhibition designers, and being able to have conversations with them was sometimes really challenging to do that.
Well, yeah, for sure. I'm wondering, and I want to keep you on here to talk about this kind of next set of questions, and then we can also hear from our other panelists, because what you mentioned kind of moves on to this. What you're saying about being in contact and connecting with people around the world, slowing down in the sense of like caring about the people we're working with, and caring about our colleagues, and so on. So in this current tumultuous time, where we're not just dealing with a global pandemic, but also climbing global temperatures, social injustices, mass global migrations, these things are escalating. How, I mean, it's a big question, I understand, but maybe you can perhaps maybe see this on like where you stand in your perspective of like how you work and how you would like to continue working. So how is your institution, or how are your institutions, the 4 of you, considering the art ecosystems, as this phrase this word art ecosystems was used to describe this panel, but how are these considering the art ecosystems within the communities in the Emirates, and specifically also thinking of inclusivity at this time, and how are they also linked globally? Maybe Laila, you can start us off.
I think we, in a way, effectively through our, so this year 2020, the curator for the Biennale, Hashim Sarkis, his whole question was, how will we live together, which was very timely, and obviously announced way before the pandemic started. and our which then became very, timely. So our curators anyway, we already within our architecture exhibitions, because we did an open call, for example, unlike our art pavilions where we do nominations usually. For architecture for 2020, we decided to do an international open call to kind of unearth all the different people globally who might be doing research in and around the region, but on topics that are globally relevant, so to speak. So in the end, yes, the committee selected a locally based firm, but because the topic that they chose, which is, how do we live together as architects? You use a material that contributes, is one of the third largest contributors to see carbon emissions in the world, which is the production of concrete. Like, how can we as practitioners in that field solve or find solutions towards that? Now, they're practitioners, so they partnered up with other institutions who through their research, they found other institutions who were already doing this research and built partnerships with them. So my answer to your question is collaboration and transparency. People need to share. We need to find more ways to share kind of research. We also need to enable research. So I think also with this pandemic, what came out is that, as a lot of my colleagues mentioned, they started, research grants, that kind of thing. These are really, really, really important. And I think in terms on a government level, the necessity for these research grants and kind of just allowing people to explore ideas and topics is super important if you want to create diversity of conversation or exploration and moving forward to kind of figure out what is our future going to look like. You can't figure it out on your own. You need others to help you do that. So we're doing it. So come to the pavilion and you'll see.
I can't wait to go anywhere. But definitely the pavilion.
We are going to try to figure out a way to have some other, because we know even if Venice is open in May, I don't know that everyone can still or will feel comfortable going. So I think we're going to have to try and find a way to share that.
Or we'll fit in Venice with social distancing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. 6 feet apart.
You'll fall off to the canal.
We've got some months to figure it out. But.
Does anyone else want to tackle this question and kind of go more in depth? I know that there was talk about research and there was talk about also funding, giving grants, micro grants, and so on. How anyone wanted to jump in here and also think about how this kind of also can be maintained, this kind of new way of working, and but also thinking about inclusivity and linking that globally. Anyone wants to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, I don't want to be out of sync with the rest of the world, but I feel kind of quite positive at the moment. I think I'm a little bit intoxicated by being able to hang out with the youth recently. So we had our youth assembly takeover at Jameel Art Centre, and 25 artists curated by 9 assembly members, all of whom are under the age of 26. And all UAE based and brought up. And it was just a real kind of blast, I guess, to realize that these generations, maybe in their 20s and early 30s, are much more compressed in the UAE and really incredibly engaged and passing the baton on from one to the other very kind of succinctly. I mean, just to sort of take a step back, I guess we're all involved in these kind of histories in the UAE, and one thing that's always been something that we've kind of debated is the kind of the older generation who were the pioneers, the position that, I mean, I'm so glad Reem is hearing what you said about the Cultural Foundation, because in the early 2000s as well, for me, the Cultural Foundation was, I mean, in those days you didn't think anything of like driving to Abu Dhabi to catch a film or, have dinner and come back again. We've kind of, our sense of geography has kind of changed a bit, but it's was such a seminal kind of space. And then you had a kind of sort of a gap before the next generation. And now suddenly what we've seen the last 10 years is a real kind of consolidation, I think, of all that work, particularly that everybody here and all our institutions and other colleagues who are not here today did in terms of education. So while we don't have an art college, we have Forza School at SAF and all the internships that you've done. You had the Venice Biennale internship program, which I think is incredibly impactful. You know, everything going on at the Cultural Foundation, but also everything else you've done, Reem, over the years in different kind of institutions as well. And just about, you know, this kind of patchwork that exists out there. And today I went to see the Zayed University case graduation show. It was on at D3, and it was just really interesting to sort of think there was that generation coming out of college, the youth above them a few years older who were showing with us just now, and then you have generations above that, a lot of whom have been through all these kind of programs and received this kind of patchwork. So it gives you an enormous amount of kind of hope in the ecosystem of the future being driven maybe less institutionally and more through all these informal kind of networks. And then on the sort of global kind of scale, you know, I guess we've also, I mean, we're a very super young institution, you know, but we've never had as many international conversations as we have this year, and ones that are really based on kind of curatorial ideas and research. So rather than in other, you know, positions in the UAE, we've often been approached by international institutions who maybe kind of primarily might think, I want to collaborate with somebody in the Gulf because they might have the funds. Sorry to sound so kind of cynical. And I think that conversation has really, really changed in recent years for everybody working here, as to one of, you know, insightful ideas are coming out of the Gulf and out of the UAE, and I want to engage with these ideas because also the UAE is in a particular position in terms of sort of geography and outreach and the kind of flow of concepts and ideas, and these institutions want to be a part of it, and that's enormously kind of exciting. And then on the informal kind of global networks, yeah, again, just going back to the incredible youth assembly members who organize their own online program of about 20 workshops and talks, and we were just gobsmacked to see people registering from all over Latin America, from South Asia, from different parts of the Arab world, you know, we all through kind of word of mouth and I guess social media. And the youth themselves have these kind of networks, and they were able to draw them into the institution, and their conversations were really exciting. So I don't know, I guess I want to put a positive spin on things, and
Yeah,
these ecosystems are bedding down and growing, but of course they won't do that alone. And I second everything Laila said about research, and that's something with the Jameel Library. We've been really, really trying to focus on collecting exhibition histories, tracing them, and then commissioning people to come up with kind of experimental research ideas and to think in public with the public about
certainly that's really important, and to continue this kind of endeavor even in this non-formalized educational settings and so on. I mean, I did the writing workshop with Bidun, you know, and I now write. So you know, there have been, you know, there have been these platforms that have been available to people living in the United Arab Emirates, and I would also say not only kind of for a certain group of people, but also inclusive to expats, such as myself at that time, and the greater community. So that's great to hear. I'm just going to move. Somebody is just come to have a conversation with us too. You see, as I said, it'll happen at some point. I just want to hear, you know, if Nawar or Reem want to add to this as well.
Should I go?
Sure.
Well, I mean, also, I mean, going off on what Antonia was saying on kind of looking back at how far our organizations have been developed and looking at the way that we operate. I mean, in our specific model in Sharjah, we, you know, before Sharjah Art Foundation was here, there was an arts movement in Sharjah in the 80s, which then, you know, there was the Emirates Fine Art Society doing exhibitions. There was in the 80s, there was a biennial in the 90s. In the early 2000s, there was a direction to change a biennial that operated in a way of country representation to one of where, you know, there was a curator and individual artist had a voice. And I think the model has been shifting and changing. And I think Sharjah Art Foundation is an example of a foundation that emerged out of a biennial, which was a grassroots initiative. We're an organization that really is very grassroots. You know, we operate in response to what audiences want or need. We work on programs and projects in response to what we think works at a certain time. We're constantly changing and evolving and looking at different ecosystems in the UAE. I mean, we operate in we operate in the Emirate of Sharjah, but we operate in smaller towns of Sharjah. So in Kalba, Kharfakan, Madam, etc., we've got art centers and we work with completely different audiences. It's very important for us to be able to not just provide or give access to programming and exhibitions and events, but also to be able to interact with different audiences and to look at our very diverse audience in Sharjah and the UAE and see what it is that people need and what works and what doesn't. And it's really amazing to see how far we've all come along. And going back to what you were saying in the beginning, Fawz, when we met each other, I think we all kind of met around 10 years ago and we were in completely different places. And to see how we've all grown and how our organizations have grown, it's really interesting to see also how each emirate has kind of developed and progressed and how we're all kind of part of this really exciting ecosystem where we've got institutions and museums and galleries and all of it really, I mean, it's an ecosystem, but it's all really quite grassroots. It's what people want, it's what people need. And I think it's really important for us as institutions, not just right now, but moving forward, to be quite flexible and to be intuitive and to be able to take, to be able to adapt, to different challenges, different needs, different points of time, whether it is, economical situations or political situations. But I think as organizations, specifically, I mean, for us as a government organization, we're always looking to provide access to things that are kind of not always there, if that makes sense. We try to fill the gaps. We didn't have an art school. Our Sharjah Art Foundation came out of a biennial. We did arts programming, but today we have an art school and we have art institutions in Sharjah and in the UAE. So I think it's important for us to always be able to be close enough to our audiences and that we're echoing what people need and not necessarily imposing. And I think that's something that we can kind of see across the table in all of our different organizations. And I think that's really important. And I think that's the way to move forward.
Fantastic. That's really fantastic. Reem, do you want to add to Nawar?
Yeah, I mean, just in brief, to add to this discussion and to really kind of pinpoint some of the questions, some of the kind of core of your question. I mean, what I feel is really important that has happened in the UAE, and I think of it, and I'm trying to look at it from like a larger perspective, right? Looking at all our institutions and the past year, and in relation to what you're talking about, all these urgencies that are happening elsewhere. I would say that there are a couple of pillars that are really important for this place, and they have been community. They have been a sense of openness. They have been a sense of education and finding, our ties with deep history. And I will say another thing is indigeneity. Indigenous practices for this place is something kind of inherent for it. So these are all elements that we felt, connected with a lot of people from across the world. There is a level of connection and openness that allows itself through our multitude of institutions and projects. You and I, Fawz, both worked on the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi project where we were investigating those exact questions, looking at the deep histories of the entire, not just regional, but transnational world to represent these untold stories, right? And the ungovernable kind of stories that need that kind of platform and voice. So, I've seen this happen in the UAE in a multitude of ways, in a way to try to answer some of the inequities that are happening elsewhere. So I think what we're starting to see from the Louvre Abu Dhabi to the museums to Sharjah's great kind of exhibitions, Art Jameel, Venice, all of it, we've started to weave a full story connected to the larger region with deep histories, but also very, very international at the same time.
Is this, are these also within your projects, whether the Cultural, Art Foundation, I mean, yes, the work done with the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi project and so on, but this work, is it being archived? Is there somehow I mean, obviously there's always problems with the archive and so on, but like, how is that, like these kinds of institutional, you know, memory or collective memories and these stories, how are they being archived, saved for people to go back to see kind of the UAE and the network that comes out of it as well?
I think that's a very kind of valid question, and one that I feel very specific. I'm someone who's very sensitive to that question, coming from Palestine, where I've seen institution legacies evaporate, where there's a big kind of culling, unfortunately, that has happened to our kind of roots and our institutional buildups and all our efforts. And I think that's this kind of erasure is really, really problematic. And I think what has happened in the UAE at large is, at least where it has to do with cultural institution, and I'm talking here largely about the things that I know, and I've been acquainted with a lot of the institutions across the board, but specifically to Abu Dhabi as well. We do a lot of documentation, be it with publications, yes, there are archives that are available. And at the same time, for example, we were doing an exhibition towards end of next year about the history and legacy of المجمع, about the Cultural Foundation for 30 years. We were able to, find all these resources from the various archives, the National Archives, the actual foundation, the Emirates, foundation, and a lot of other institutions that have had that kind of those archives, and we were able to kind of use it in order to do these kind of shows. But now we have the online platform as well, and that's another important resource that we're starting to develop quite avidly, and becomes very accessible for even wider audiences to look into these resources. Are we transforming the historical archives into the online? I'll say that hasn't been a full project that has been implemented yet, and maybe that's a valid question.
Okay, well, that's really great. And speaking of resources, I mean, each of your institutions, has these resources that and aims to kind of strengthen ties within your communities in the UAE and globally, as you've all explained and described so far. And also, I mean, I'm keeping in mind the responsibilities and mandates that these, your arts institutions outline, and kind of the ways that you want to support and cultivate the various arts communities in your cities. I'm wondering, and Nawar made me think about this as well with what she was saying. Are there any specific concrete answers to say, okay, this is where and how our resources are needed most at this moment? Like this is what we, Cultural Foundation, the UAE Pavilion, Jameel Arts Center, there are, and by the way, there are many other institutions, smaller scale institutions, grassroots, collectives that are all working really hard. Things, that are happening consistently throughout the UAE among artists and cultural practitioners that, that are being done, publishing platforms, podcasts, so on. But where do you feel that your resources are needed most, as to not even just like overlap and everyone is, how can we differentiate between grant giving from one institution to the other? Or, where do you feel like your resources are needed most? I would say maybe Reem, you can, because I have you here on screen, you can, might.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, kind of, I go back, I pivot to the fact that, we are still providing for a lot of a landscape of learning, and we really need to really, I want to say, build our audiences and diversify those multidisciplines in the various arts, and really think public at the same time. So I think these are, now the weather is so beautiful most of the year. It's like, it's a miracle. So we can enjoy a lot of things actually outdoors. So it's a new kind of, I want to say that there is a new reality that is happening. We really need to think about how do we do this kind of outreach to and diversify our audiences even further? How public can we become, and how, you know, interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary with our practices could we also really kind of transform our programs and our projects? These are the kind of most important things to my mind. They're maybe not the resources, but they are the kind of crucial questions for us moving forward as institutions.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And sorry.
I was just going to say that I really agree with everything that Reem just said, and just thinking about kind of how to work within our patchwork of different institutions in our different emirates and plug gaps, you know, that exist kind of for the UAE wide. So, you know, critical writing and the encouragement of critique and its place in public forums is something that I think still needs, it's a missing piece of the pie in our kind of arts ecosystem and needs an awful lot of attention. And just, and I guess just, you know, two things. One, to think about, you know, this has been an exceptionally tough year and it will be for the next couple of years. And we're all, I mean, running, you know, buildings and looking after team members and, you know, working with artists. And sometimes there are very, you know, hard realities where you of shifting budget from one place to another just to kind of stay alive. So, you know, there's kind of a very cold, hard reality there of being in an arts institution anywhere in the world right now. And I think there's something, you know, sort of thinking ahead to the future, one thing that somehow, in terms of thinking about a public, yes, there's reaching out to an ever kind of broader public and engaging them, and learning is an absolute, you know, central kind of quest, I think, for all of us, all the way through from kids, you know, through to lifelong learners. But it's also about how to engage a sense of kind of patronage and philanthropy in the UAE wide as well. So I feel there's still a little bit of a gap where people, there's the government and everything that the government is doing, and, you know, to, you know, quite incredible levels, especially if you compare kind of globally, not regionally, but globally. And but then there's, you know, there are a lot of people here who are, you know, making good businesses and building up kind of corporations, and it's about how do you kind of engage with those kind of levels of patrons, to get through to those patrons and really encourage them to see supporting the arts as something that they can do to give back to a country that's kind of nurtured them. So I kind of feel that's something that over the years, I mean, we've all been talking about this for more than 20 years now, but it hasn't quite sort of embedded down into society. And you know, albeit this is a tough time, but still, you know, people do have the resources, and it would be incredible to kind of see that really wedded into the arts ecology as a whole. And then just picking up on what you said about outdoor spaces, I read this great article recently by Eddie Heathcote in the FT, he's the architecture critic, and he kind of said sculpture parks and outdoor kind of art spaces are going to be the cultural forums of the future. And it really kind of stuck with me. And I mean, we're very lucky at Jameel Arts Centre. We do have a sculpture park with us, and we can see that it's an incredible way to sort of draw people in. You know, people come for a walk in the park, and before you know it, you've kind of kidnapped them, and they're, you know, watching a Lawrence Abu Hamdan video. And it's kind of, you know, it's an amazing way to kind of broker a conversation with the public that wouldn't not ordinarily come into a museum. So just, I think that's in terms of our work and how we reach out to different, you know, kind of communities. I think for all of us, it's an exceptionally high level in the UAE of reaching out to non-usual suspects. So last year, we estimated around 75% of our audience were coming to a museum for the first time when they walked in our doors. And that's including, you know, canvassing school kids and everything. And that, you know, then the level of conversation you're having and the potential impact is really significant if you can take that conversation forward and broker a conversation between artist and viewer.
Thank you. I know that we have 5 minutes left, and I have just one last thing that, you know, I'd like to ask all of you in those last 5 minutes that we have before, you know, maybe we might have some time for the Q&A as well, which I'd really like to get to. Other than, you know, what lessons that we've all learned this time, you know, at this time, and what are the gaps that have been revealed, you know, and what are the new questions to be asking towards working to the future. And it's, especially at this time, it's like you said, Antonia, it's going to continue being hard for a while. And this time around the world, you know, this has been, to those that didn't know earlier, now it's like a really kind of this big reveal that there are these major injustices there, that are happening. How do we give voice to those who are not heard, who are not represented, or who do not have a chance at the to get to the platform, to have their voices heard? And like you said, you know, reaching out to unusual suspects and your, you know, new kind of individuals emerging as your audiences for Jameel, like you were saying, Antonia. But yeah, I'm kind of curious to hear you as we wrap this up. What are the lessons that have been learned? What are the gaps that have revealed themselves? And how are you going to give voice to those who are underrepresented and be able to kind of really strengthen your communities, broaden your communities, and reach out to within the UAE, within the greater region, you know, where there is a lot that continues to happen, and there's a lot that we can do, and then there's a lot that it's kind of really difficult to maneuver from the level of working for an arts institution, for example. But I'd love to hear you kind of speak about that, and I hope that can also be thought of as a kind of positive way of ending things, because there are people like yourselves that are working towards you know, equity, towards representation, towards tackling these issues that are difficult to discuss, that are challenging, I might say, actually, and to always endeavor to be on the right side of history. So I'd love to hear from you before we open it up to any questions. And anyone can start.
I'll go. Okay. Why not? I think, you know, I mean, one of the beauties of my many years here is that, and one of the reasons why I continue to stay, I mean, there's always a lot of work to be done. There's always things that we can improve. But one of the unique things about being here is that our ability to adapt, our adaptability, and our sense of inclusiveness and community, like, which has been repeated many, many times. So I think if we continue to do those things, I mean, ideally, for example, things like the Artist Relief Fund that the Ministry of Culture instituted during this pandemic, what I would like to see is something like that kind of institutionalized, and it be more than just a relief fund, and be an ongoing kind of federal fund that everyone can tap into that lives here, whoever you might be, if you're committed in living here in the country. So those kind of things. Antonia touched on this need for patronage. It's really, really needed. And so this is a kind of work that, I mean, there's certain individuals who are already doing those things, but there needs to be more, for sure. And then also just to kind of encourage and support for younger initiatives like the Engage 101 platform that just kind of started by Mudira and Reem. And, you know, it's an alternative way of looking for young artists to get their artwork shown and sold, and, you know, to encourage those kind of, platforms or initiatives so that they can grow into something else. And that's, I think, all of those things. I don't think there's one thing, there's multiple things that we can do and continue to encourage. So that'll be my brief answer.
Thank you. Anybody else? Maybe Nawar?
I mean, I think kind of what, Antonia and Laila were both saying, I think it's important, something that I think none of us can stop saying is we need more support. And it's not just about support from specific individuals, but it's more of, support from the ecosystem that we're in, the government. We need policies to support us through the work that we're trying to do. We need support on the grounds, whether it's from, organizations or other institutions or individuals. Something that we've all seen, I think, as a repeated pattern is that a lot of individuals and a lot of artists were left without jobs or without sources of income or without opportunities. And a lot of people jumped in and, gave opportunities. The Ministry of Culture were doing things, Salama Foundation were doing things, we were doing things in Sharjah. And I think it's important to remember that these support structures are things that we need to do year round, all of us, I think collectively. It's not enough for us to do it in a time of need. We've got grants that we do for films and for productions, but that's not to say that we can't do more or that we can't, pull together and provide grants for other different things or for different, forms of art. I think it's really important to also, I think for a lot of us, remember is that our role as, as organizations and institutions, I think sometimes we have a specific focus. And this is kind of going back to what I was saying about organizations needing to be open and flexible and working with audiences. I mean, during the pandemic, because a lot of things were closed and artists were not, in studios or producing work, everybody moved towards, or not everybody, but a lot of people moved towards giving grants for research or for writing. And these are things that, most of the time, the biggest grants go towards things that are more on like the production side or, a big prize for an artist to produce work, but the research is equally important. And I think these are things that we kind of sometimes tend to forget. So I think it would be great to see more of that. I mean, I know in our specific experience, we're looking at opening our residencies to different platforms and different forms of residencies, looking at different forms of grants that we can give towards the future. So I think it's always important to kind of not fall into that trap of doing, the same thing. And artists need more than just production. There's a lot of research that goes into it that nobody wants to fund. People want to fund a big project and put their name on it, but actually the research is equally, if not more important than the final product. So I think these are things that we've all kind of been thinking about from our side anyway, specifically. So.
Great. Reem or Antonia, both final words?
Yeah, I mean, everything that's been said is absolutely on point. I think, further cultivation of a sense of social and cultural responsibility, be it from corporations or the ecosystem, is one of the important things. And really kind of the government assisting us in kind of mandating that as well is something that would be really important in terms of policy making for the to keep this vibrant art scene and cultural scene, as active and even more ongoing than now. And at the same time, I think what we're all kind of hinting at the same time is the importance of producing critical knowledge. Which is, essential at this stage on all levels of our institutions it's not purely for aesthetics, it's not purely for market, but it really needs to be about producing critical knowledge in order to build the foundations of our cultural scene on something that is steadfast. And that's something that I think is, it's very important. It also might push the limits of comfort for a lot of our protagonists and people that we work with, but it's very important in order to push the scene further. It's really essential.
Yes, push the limits of comfort, as you say, and also as Antonia was saying, open criticism, and then as also Laila was saying, and all of you, patronage, but various different ways of patronage and support, not only coming, perhaps from the top down, but also at a more horizontal kind of level with the people. I think those are really important takeaways and things to think about. And, with, I think people, individuals, women like you at the helm, I think I know from working with each of you individually or having conversations with you or seeing the work that you do, I see that how you kind of work with the challenges, work with the positives and the negatives, and kind of have to constantly negotiate your positions, but also the institutions and what they are doing and how they will continue, you know, not just looking back at the past decade and all the, you know, successes that have been happening, that have happened thus far, but also towards the next decade, and how to allow the arts to thrive, for artists to thrive, for people from all, you know, economic backgrounds to also kind of have a seat at the table, be able to enter the institutions, to engage with the art, to engage with this kind of discursive, you know, turn towards, you know, talking about, you know, I mean, at the heart of it, everybody, a lot of the artists you're working with and a lot of the thematics and things, the programming that you're doing does have this will and desire and need to support these kind of issues pertaining, you know, to our lives, to our societies and our communities on a micro level, but also on a larger scale. Because after all, the UAE has always been this place that has also, you know, connected us to different places, because we all come from different places. I mean, just this panel, you know, can show you the diversity within this small country, and the ability within that for, you know, these people to kind of do their work and to support others. I'm excited to see what you'll be doing for the next decade. And if we have any questions, perhaps we can, I'm just going to click on the Q&A and see, we have a few questions. Individual organizations. Okay, so this here, this has been a very inspiring panel, thank you. Collaboration was mentioned several times as something that had been strengthened on account of the pandemic. Are you seeing a proactive increase in collaboration across borders between the different GCC countries, as well as locally and internationally? Might there be new levels of greater support to be gained from closer cross-country collaboration between governments and cultural institutions? And if so, what might that look like at a practical level? Equally happy for anyone on the panel to answer this. This is from Wal Balston. Would anyone like to answer this question?
Yeah, I'm happy just to say something quickly. I mean, I think the last couple of years has seen an ever closer relationship between Saudi and the UAE when it comes to the kind of cultural exchange. And I mean, with our Jameel, we're building a creative hub in Jeddah, so working on that program quite closely and seeing that there's a lot of artists in Jeddah that are very keen to connect with their counterparts in the UAE. So I think it'd be really, fantastic to try and get exchanges going and to really recognize that kind of use and peer-to-peer kind of exchange and what we can do in that regard. With other Gulf countries as well. I mean, thinking for the Gulf, but also further ahead in the region as well. I mean, Reem mentioned an ever kind of greater sense of collaboration between different Middle Eastern countries. I mean, if that could be achieved then against all the odds with everything going on, then that would be really something for us to work on for the next 10 years. It's hugely important, I think. I mean, what's, I guess, really exciting on this panel is that all the 4 projects that we're engaged with are all kind of homegrown to a certain extent. They're not imports from elsewhere. They're all things that have been developed from the ground up here in the UAE according to, and in a kind of reflexive and responsive way, as Nawar pointed out as well. So listening from the ground up. And then to take that kind of spirit out to the rest of the GCC and further afield to the rest of the Arab world at this moment feels particularly kind of urgent and crucial.
Would anybody else like to answer this question?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer very briefly. we've worked with multiple institutions across DCT and in Abu Dhabi. I'm aware of a lot of work that has happened with GCC countries, be it on heritage, arts, education, a multitude of platforms, especially during COVID. This kind of, cooperation has not subsided. If anything, it has, further been activated. And at the same time, our partnerships with international organizations continue. I see it every day with a lot of partners that we have with the Culture Summit. We've expanded to include a lot of new partners as well from the region and beyond, from Asia, from other places. We've been able to do small seminars with, representative of institutions from all over the world, focus groups, etc. So it's, this is something that has become very active for us and very accessible from within our institutions in the UAE. And it's been a pillar of how we've always wanted to operate, right? It's always outward looking at the same time as it's inward looking. So this is something we're faithful to remain and to, allow for the new tools that are available to us to really keep on cultivating this dialogue and this collaboration further. Yeah.
Thank you, Reem. I think that I'm being prompted that we need to wrap it up right now. But I do encourage you to have a look at the questions. There are some other questions in the Q&A screen, and hopefully take that along with you as you continue to do your really excellent work. Thank you to those who came today. I wish I could see everyone's faces, but hopefully we can reconvene again in the not too distant future. Thank you again to the team at Abu Dhabi Art, and thank you Nawar, Antonia, Laila, Reem. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Fawz.
Thank you, Fawz. It was so lovely to see everybody, even through these channels. Brings us together in small ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
See you guys soon.
Yeah, see you.
Bye.
Bye.